We can see a girl running in a forest and screaming for help. As she gets to a mansion, she calls someone. On the other hand, a man picks up the phone. As girl says she is stuck and need help, man assures her that soon he is sending some help. Suddenly 2 guys come wearing black color suit. They start beating up the girl and kill her. We can see a plane which landing on the island. A girl named Julia informs Mr. Rourke that the plane is finally arriving. Mr. Rourke gets his staff all together to greet their guests. We can see 5 contestants participating in the fantasy island: Melanie, JD, Brax, Patrick, and Gwen. Julia introduces herself to the contestants as Rourke's assistant, saying Rourke will meet them later before taking them to their rooms. We can see a man is watching all the contestants from the forest, named Damon. Moments later, stepbrothers Rax and JD waits at the bar while the other contestants gets in their rooms. Meanwhile, Julia tells Gwen that Rourke takes each fantasy specifically to the guest, and tells her life is about to change forever. Then Julia nose bleeds as she leaves. Once Julia's gone, as Gwen is changing her clothes, she notices some footprints in the bathroom, and sees a burnt man in the mirror. She gets scared, but he quickly disappears. That night, the guests gather at the bar while waiting for Rourke. There, JD reveals to Patrick how his dad married Brax's mom when he was still a kid, and the men introduce themselves to each other. Melanie asks Patrick, what is his fantasy? But he doesn't know how the whole thing works. So Melanie says it's virtual reality, and Patrick starts to think that it will be some sort of new experience for him. However, Gwen wants to know if the fantasy will involve a person from their lives. As they are talking, Rourke finally shows up and introduces himself to the contestants, and answers their question about fantasy. Rourke tells the contestants that there's only one fantasy per guest and that they must see through to its natural conclusion. He also adds that fantasies rarely play out as anyone might expect, but they always play out exactly as they should at the same time. Rourke says that everything will begin after a good night's rest, but since JD and Brax don't have the rooms yet, the host informs them their fantasy's about to start. A few minutes later, JD and Brax follow Rourke outside while walking. JD keeps calling Brax T, an old nickname he hates. Then Rourke brings the brothers to a mansion, revealing that their fantasy is about to start. As he leaves, JD and Brax both starts to enjoy the party. As Brax is smoking, he sees a bunt man walking in front of him, but soon he disappears. Brax thinks he is just getting high. The next day, Rourke calls Gwen to his office, where he talks to her about her fantasy of getting a do-over. Gwen says if it's too tough she can change her fantasy, but Rourke says it's going to be a challenge, but he likes her fantasy. Rourke learns that she turned down a marriage proposal, and Rourke asks her, will she rethink? He leads her to a room where her fantasy awaits. Behind the doors, Gwen finds her ex-fiancé Alan waiting for her at a restaurant. They reach to a table and Alan is treating her very nicely. Gwen is confused by her behavior. Even though she didn't speak to him for 5 years, however, Alan says he has no idea what she's talking about, saying he saw her in his bed that morning. Gwen realizes everything is not real, it's a fantasy. Gwen tries to talk to Rourke and says that's not what she wanted. Rourke simply tells her not to ruin her second chance to say yes to Alan's marriage proposal, adding that everything is as real as she makes it on Fantasy Island. Meanwhile, Patrick joins Melanie as she drinks and finally reveals his fantasy to enlist, but his mom made him promise that he wouldn't. On the other hand, Melanie admits that her fantasies exact revenge on her bully Sloane. Melanie had to see a shrink. She calls Dr. Torture because of Sloane, and now she wants to feel what it's like to be on the other end. Rourke shows up and instructs Melanie to head to the elevator and push the button for the floor with no name. Melanie reaches to room which is dark. She starts recording and places her phone on a shelf. Then she turns on a switch and finds Sloane in another room, separated by glass, and bound to a chair. Melanie thinks that she is a hologram and not real. She reads a letter, stating she can press the buttons for a variety of revenge. She gets eager and Melanie presses a button, which electrocutes Sloane. She then pushes more buttons to continue torturing Sloane, and eventually sees a video of her with a man who's not her husband. She lost the video online. After that, Melanie presses another button and sees some footage of her husband Will, who watches his wife's leaked video and calls her to know if that's where she's been in the last 2 days. Melanie realizes something is wrong. She says she's done, unable to believe that the host would actually kidnap someone in real for her fantasy. Meanwhile, Rourke takes Patrick into the woods, where Damon warns him that the entire island is not what he thinks. Their conversation is cut short by some soldiers, so Damon immediately hides Patrick. Just tell the soldiers he's part of a covert operation, but the men don't believe him and take him with them. Back at the restaurant, Gwen finally accepts Alan's marriage proposal, despite knowing it's just a fantasy. Then we can see Stepbrothers finds a panic room and armory where Brax decides to take a grenade. JD throws the grenade into the water using a baseball pitching machine. Meanwhile, Patrick finally meets the soldiers' leader. Lieutenant Sullivan. Patrick instantly recognizes the man as his father and demands to see Rourke, yelling, "That's not what he asked for." Then Sullivan sees his name on Patrick's dog tags and asks him how he has that name on his tag. Suddenly they get attacked by their enemies. On the other hand, a surgeon enters Sloane's room. Melanie then bangs on the glass to stop. She realizes that he's Dr. Torture. However, Dr. Torture ignores her and cuts Sloane's arm, so Melanie presses a button, which triggers a loud alarm and distracts him. After that, Melanie instructs Dr. Torture to cut off Sloane's right ring finger, but when he's about to do it, Melanie presses a button and electrocutes him. She also presses another button to douse him with water, and he falls on the ground. She breaks the glass separating and helps Sloane to get out. At the end of JD and Brax, one of the model gets shot, so they immediately head to the panic room. Then Brax calls Rourke and informs him of their situation. So the host tells him the intruders are probably Kalasho's men. Kalasho used to own that house and doesn't want any interference. The panic room closes, as Brax is talking to Rourke, leaving the Stepbrothers outside. Stepbrothers starts panicking, but the host reminds them they must see their fantasy through to its natural conclusion and ends the call. Sloane tries to understand how Melanie ended up on the island, thinking she's been kidnapped too. Dr. Torture arrives again and tries to kill Stolen, but Damon saves them by stabbing the doctor. He then tells the ladies to come with him. As Gwen is sleeping, she feels the burnt man strangling her. She wakes up and learns it's just a nightmare. Patrick regains consciousness and walks around upon hearing a sound. The burnt man tries to choke him. As he wakes and realizes it's just a dream, Sullivan wants to talk to him privately. Sullivan wants to know why Patrick has a picture of him and his son, so Patrick says that's him when he was 9. However, Sullivan doesn't believe Patrick and shows him his ID, asking why it has its son's name and birthday on it. Not sure how to prove he's Patrick, Sullivan and Patrick tells his father, thinks only he knows. Eventually the lieutenant believes Patrick, and Patrick realizes that his real fantasy is to see his father. Patrick tells Sullivan he died saving his men on a classified mission in Venezuela, and Sullivan says they'll go there the next day. The following day, Gwen wakes up and sees a photo of her with Alan, realizing they're already married. She is not able to process and decides to talk to Rourke, but the host reveals that they've already been married for 5 years, adding that they have a daughter, Lila. Gwen sees more pictures of her family in her phone, and starts having flashbacks remembering Lila while she was growing up. Rourke reveals the island's power, saying he looked for it with his wife years ago. However, she died before they reached the island, so when he discovered that place, he wished for her to live again and return just as he met her. Rourke has to stay on the island to be with his wife forever and organize the fantasies for the guests in the woods. Patrick tells Sullivan his men will die without him, revealing that he was killed when he threw himself on a grenade to save them. The two get into a physical fight and Patrick points a gun at his father and tells him he'll help him complete his mission. Stepbrothers explain that do not know about Kalashov and money. Gwen feels guilty for having the chance to live with Alan and Lila. She then talks to Rourke and asks her a new fantasy. He reminds her the guest can only have one fantasy. Damon takes Melanie and Sloane into a cave. Melanie sees a burnt man in the cave. She ignores it and they find a glowing rock with spring water. Damon explains that the water grants anyone's deepest desire, and he has been hired to find about this island. Damon collects some spring water to expose Rourke in front of the world. Rourke can bring loved ones and turn them into black-eyed zombie. Damon instructs Melanie to call the pilot and get out from this island as soon as they can. Then the rock shows that Melanie's fantasy was to ruin Sloane's life, and the two girls get into an argument because of that. However, since they're running out of time, Melanie eventually asks Damon to lead her back to the hotel. Gwen tells Julia that she wants a new fantasy. She reveals that because of her someone died in the fire. Gwen confronts Rourke and demands to get the do-over she really wanted, returning her rings and heading to another room. Gwen tries to save her neighbor Nick Taylor from the fire in their apartment building, and she comes across JD and breaks on the stairwell. However, they don't recognize her. She asks a cop for help. Then Gwen realizes that the cop is Patrick, who also doesn't recognize her. Frustrated, Gwen returns her unit to get a hammer, only to pass out seconds later. Meanwhile, Brax runs and hides in the armory, where he gets a gun to shoot one of Devil Face's. Dr. Torture attacks Damon and eventually stabs him. Damon pushes him off the cliff. Melanie takes his map. Patrick helps Sullivan rescue hostages in Venezuela who turn out to be JD and Brax. Patrick thinks Brax is one of the bad guys because he's wearing a mask and holding a grenade. So he stops Brax. As they are talking, Devil Face and his minion starts fighting. Patrick and Brax fight back. Sullivan and his team rescued JD and the models. Unfortunately, they're unaware that every bad guy they kill turns into a black-eyed zombie outside. Patrick finally kills Devil. The black-eyed zombie starts shooting up, killing JD and Sullivan's men. Sullivan then orders Patrick to leave and the zombies shoot his father. At the same time, Melanie Sloane returned to the torture room where Sloane calls Will and tells him that she's been kidnapped and asks for his help. She instructs him to call the number Damon gave Melanie, to call the plane. Brax, Patrick find Melanie and Sloane, and they all quickly head for the dock. Unfortunately, Rourke and his men intercept them in the lobby. Gwen knows that they were brought there because of Nick, who turns out to be Brax and JD's roommate. Gwen admits that she started the fire in the building, and she also points out that Patrick was there, but he didn't do anything. Meanwhile, Melanie reveals that she was supposed to go on a date with Nick that night, but she got cold feet. Now that the guests know that everything is just one big revenge fantasy because they all have their hand in Nick's death, Rourke admits that it will end with their deaths. Then plane finally arrives, but the plane is shot down by Double Face. Then they hide in forest. Melanie shows them the map to the screen with an ancient stone, and Sloane tells them the water from it makes the fantasies possible. So they plan to destroy the spring. They all get separated once they're inside the cave. Patrick is pulled underwater by several hands, and it isn't long before he faces his zombified Sullivan. As Sloane tries to deal with her inner demon, she gets attacked by Dr. Torture. Brax talks to a zombified JD, who blames him for his death. Brax runs away from there as Double Face shoots JD. Gwen follows Lila's voice and finds her killing Alan. Nick then shows up and holds Lila's hand. He says he's not responsible for what's happening. Patrick manages to kill Sullivan, but Melanie suddenly stabs him. Gwen searches for Patrick upon hearing his screams and comes across Brax. Now Melanie shows up with Dr. Torture and Sloane. As it turns out, everything is Melanie's fantasy and she really liked Nick. Unfortunately, he died before they could go on a date and she blames the other guests for that. Sloane distracts Melanie so Brax and Gwen can grab the knife and grenade from her. Gwen punches Melanie while Brax stabs Dr. Torture and Sloane quickly runs away with them. They look for the spring. Once they find the spring, Rourke shows up and reveals that Julia is her fantasy because she's his wife. Rourke's wish was to have her back just as he met her, so Julia would appear without knowing him before getting sick and dying again. Rourke grabs the grenade from Gwen and he says he has no choice but to give Melanie her fantasy, so he can get back with Julia. Seconds later, Melanie arrives and Rourke throws the grenade into the spring. Julia talks with Rourke as he walks away, asking him to let her go and save the guests. Patrick requests Melanie to let the others go. As Rourke returns and he tells them all the guests get a fantasy. Sloane drinks the spring water from the canteen, revealing that her fantasy is for Melanie and Nick to be together. A burnt Nick grabs Melanie into the spring and the black-eyed zombies eventually vanish. Melanie comes back and throws the grenade on the ground. Patrick sacrifices himself to save his friends. On the next day, Gwen Brax, Sloane, know from Rourke that Patrick died as a hero. After that, Rourke lets the guests leave since they won't remember the island, but Brax decides to stay. Brax starts working for Rourke as his new assistant and uses the name Tattoo, his stepbrother's nickname, for him. I also know an island where fantasies comes true. Wanna know? Like and share this video.